Focus this evening, GDP at 8.4%, strong recovery and growth. A very special guest is joining me to take the conversation forward. Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor, is with us to help us understand these figures better. Good evening, sir, and welcome. Now, 8.4% growth is clearly talking about an expanding economy. If you could help us simplify and understand, what do we understand through this figure in terms of the recovery from the pandemic by and large for the country?
So clearly India has had the fourth quarter now of positive growth after the decline and the contraction that happened in the first quarter last year and second quarter last year as well. Third quarter we grew at 0.4%, fourth quarter we grew at 1.6%, the first quarter of this year we grew at 20.1%, and now the economy has grown at 8.4%. Even if you compare with the pre-pandemic level, last year, this quarter, second quarter, there was a contraction of 7.4%, and now the growth of 8.4% means that we are about 0.4% higher than, compared to 2 years back. So, given that the last two quarters of the last year, there was positive growth, so I think, and that should accelerate going forward in the coming 2 quarters. Clearly, the recovery is quite robust. I must mention that while some people will contend that this is because of the base effect, I think we should still take into account the fact that the very strong recovery is noteworthy, because if base effects were indeed taken into account, that should have actually led to a prediction of the recovery last year, which did not happen. So clearly the fact that during that time of uncertainty, when the government had projected that there will be a V-shaped recovery, and now that recovery has manifested, that is something that we have to be taking cognizance of. We cannot be cherry picking the ex ante and ex post narratives. Ex ante not believe the prediction about the recovery, and ex post then say it is expected. I think that is something that is not consistent over time.
Right. And so if you were to break up this figure of growth into the key drivers that is causing it, that is leading this growth, how would you explain that to us, particularly in terms of sectoral growth? We've seen figures of manufacturing 5.5%, agriculture 4.5%. If you could give us the bigger picture.
If you combine this with the 8 core sector numbers that were also released today, right, where the 8 core sectors grew at 7.5%, I think when you put that together and you look at the fact that consumption grew at about 8.5%, I think clearly there is a good recovery. If you take into account also the fact that imports have grown significantly, imports are a very important indicator of consumption in the economy. Now, while the imports have grown, I don't think there will be any concerns on the external sector, because exports have grown concomitantly as well, and the trade balance will actually be quite comfortable. So when you put it all together, and the fact that the gross fixed capital formation in the economy at 32% of GDP has actually held steady, I think these are good signs of the investment in the economy. Private investment is picking up as well, so I think that is something which is very hearty. One more point I would mention: if you look at the government capital expenditure in the first half of this year, that has grown at 38% compared to last year, while the compared to 2 years back, it has grown at about 23%. So clearly, capital expenditure, in its own, the impact on overall investment and its impact in crowding in private investment, both of them are actually really helping the cause.
Right. Also, in your press conference, you speak about how unique. Can you hear us, sir? Are you with us? Right. So in the press conference,
I can hear you actually. That's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So in the press conference, you also mentioned about the unique nature of India's recovery, the manner in which inflation has been kept under control, given that both demand and supply were boosted in an equilibrium manner, which is different from how the world handled the pandemic. If you could tell us a little more about that, how did that come about?
this is a very important point, and actually, going forward, India's response during the COVID crisis, should become a, something that is studied very carefully by the rest of the world, because even compared to India's response during the global financial crisis, where we followed policies that are very similar to what the rest of the world has followed, which is just the Keynesian prescription of stimulating demand. I think we clearly saw what happened after the global financial crisis. For almost 1.5 years, every month inflation came in very high numbers, peaking at about 17%. Same phenomenon you are seeing now in the in the rest of the globe, with the US recording a 30-year high on inflation, emerging economies like Turkey, Brazil, etc., hitting very high double-digit inflation. All of these are because they all focused only on demand-side measures. India has been a clear exception to this policy making by understanding very clearly that the COVID pandemic creates important supply side disruptions as well, and therefore the supply has to be focused on. I think among all major economies, and including the emerging ones, India has been the only one that has taken supply side measures, keeping in mind that supply side measures require foresight, because it's not as if you start planning for increase in supply today, it happens overnight. It actually takes 8 to 9 months, maybe even longer, for it to manifest. And if you just look at the data itself, this has happened despite the lockdowns and the night curfews, all of which really create enormous supply side disruptions. So even when none of these disruptions were there during the global financial crisis, we had runaway inflation into the high double digits, and yet now with these difficulties posed by lockdown and night curfews, we've kept inflation at 6%, a little less than 6% on average last year, and now at 4.5%. That's clearly because of the clarity in policy and the foresight with which this has been implemented.
Right. Dr. Subramanian, in the run-up to the presentation of the fresh GDP figures, IMF presented an encouraging view of India's recovery path, but it also cautioned that poverty and income inequality continue to remain a challenge for India, as during the pandemic and even before that. How do you see the nature of recovery that we are making? We're also alongside addressing these two core challenges for the country.
So this is a point that I want to mention, that while we certainly should take guidance from international authorities, I think over the last year and a half, India has clearly demonstrated that it has the self-confidence and the courage of conviction to think for itself. And I think as we were discussing earlier, our policy being so different from the rest of the world and from previous global financial crisis as well, clearly demonstrates this. So I think if you go back and look at the economic survey that we wrote this year, we clearly demonstrated that growth is by far the most important determinant of inequality, because not only does it uplift sections of the vulnerable sections of the society directly through the growth. I think the last year's the fact that there was a contraction of 7.5%, and that has impacted the vulnerable sections disproportionately more, is clearly indicative of how important growth is for reducing inequality as well. At the same time, growth also generates enough tax resources to be able to do efficient welfare,
and that's where
that is something that the government has done very well over the last 6-7 years.
And at that point, sir, I wanted to talk about the interventions that the government made, especially Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, which continues in a form delivering free grains to 80 crore country people. So those interventions alongside the growth make the complete picture more holistic.
Yes, absolutely. If you look at India's demand side policies, we've been very prudent. Our demand side policies were threefold. One, we gave in-kind transfers, the free food to more than 800 million people, more than 80 crore. And we've extended it till March 2022, after which I think it will not be required. Second, we also gave cash transfers to to widows and to women. And third, we actually used the financial sector. We gave loans with guarantees, not only the loans to MSMEs and small enterprises, but at the same time also recently in Atmanirbhar Bharat 2, we also gave, loan guarantees, loans with guarantees, through by microfinance institutions, so that, those that are poor can actually avail loans. So as a result, by leveraging the data that financial sector has and the leverage itself that financial sector provides, we've been able to very judiciously, administer demand side, interventions, while keeping the overall, FIS, the cost of the FIS as well quite low. And that is what is reflected in the fact that among all emerging economies, our macro fundamentals are really looking, very, very sound, unlike countries like, Turkey, Brazil, and Mexico, which all are actually facing difficulties on their macros, inflation, etc. Like India is not facing that because of the prudent measures both on the demand and the supply side.
Right, sir. And finally, we would all wonder how to keep this momentum on, especially again in the context of the pandemic. Challenges of new variants keep coming up. As an economist, what do you think would be the most prudent measures for the government to put in action?
So I think the new variant that has come, it has to be analyzed, not only in India but also rest of the world. I think it's only a couple of weeks, and therefore, not enough is known about the variant. Whether on the health side, will it, escape the immunity provided by vaccination? I think my initial reading of, and the last couple of days I've actually done a lot of it, seems to suggest that, vaccination will continue to provide immunity against against variants. It may, change, one way or the other a little bit, but overall, on average, vaccination will continue to provide immunity. The fact that India has already done, more than 120 crore doses, I think is very important. We need to double down on providing the second dose to large sections of population, enhance coverage above 85% in the next couple of months.
Right.
At the same time, also the lessons that we learned during the second wave of the pandemic, those will serve us very well. Even if this variant does have some impact on the health side, I think the economy will be well preserved because of the lessons that we've learned from the second wave.
Right. On that note, Dr. Subramanian, thanks very much for joining us on Newsnight and sharing your perspective on India's growth figures. Moving on.